The War of 1812 placed the United States in one of the most vulnerable moments of its early history. Barely 3 decades after declaring independence, the nation found itself once again facing the might of Great Britain, a global superpower with unmatched naval dominance. By the time the conflict had stretched into its second year, the balance of power around the Great Lakes leaned heavily in favor of the British. Their control of these inland seas gave them a decisive strategic advantage, enabling the swift movement of troops, artillery, food supplies, and communication between outposts. For the Americans, the picture was bleak. Detroit had already fallen in a surrender that embarrassed the young republic, and many American settlements in the Northwest Territory remained isolated, fearful, and cut off from reliable reinforcements. The importance of Lake Erie cannot be overstated. Whoever ruled the waters essentially controlled the vast Northwest Territory. This was not just about dominance on a map, it was about the fate of American communities. If the British continued to hold the lake, they could reinforce their positions at will, maintain alliances with Native American groups resisting U.S. expansion, and strangle any hope the Americans had of reclaiming lost ground. On the other hand, should the United States manage the seemingly impossible task of wresting control from the Royal Navy, the entire regional dynamic would shift overnight. Supply lines to British-occupied Detroit would be cut, Native allies might lose confidence, and American forces could finally go on the offensive. What made this moment even more dramatic was the condition of the American Navy in early 1813. The United States had virtually no fleet on the Great Lakes. Unlike the British, who had been patrolling these waters for over a year with experienced crews and sturdy ships, the Americans were starting from nothing. Building warships hundreds of miles from the ocean, with no established infrastructure or seasoned sailors, seemed like an absurd ambition. Yet this was the gamble the U.S. Navy was willing to take, because failure to contest British supremacy on Lake Erie meant accepting permanent vulnerability in the region. Thus, when a relatively young officer named Oliver Hazard Perry stepped forward to lead the American effort, the stakes could not have been higher. Victory would secure the frontier and breathe new hope into a war many thought unwinnable. Defeat, however, might seal the fate of the Northwest, and perhaps even the war itself. To understand how the tide turned on Lake Erie, one must look closely at the man who would come to symbolize American resilience and audacity: Oliver Hazard Perry. Born in South Kingston, Rhode Island, in 1785, Perry was practically raised on salt air and naval tradition. His father, Christopher Raymond Perry, was a seasoned mariner who had sailed both as a merchant captain and a naval officer. In households like the Perrys, the sea was not just a livelihood, it was an identity. From an early age, Oliver absorbed the language of navigation, the routines of ship life, and the discipline required to survive the unpredictable dangers of the ocean. At just 13 years old, Oliver Perry began his career as a midshipman, serving under his father's command aboard the USS General Greene. Such early exposure to the Navy was not unusual for young men from maritime families, but it proved formative for Perry. He was no stranger to hardship at sea, learning the intricacies of ship handling, gunnery, and discipline while still a boy. His first true test came during the First Barbary War in the Mediterranean. There, he witnessed the U.S. Navy's growing reputation as it fought against the Barbary pirates. From those experiences, Perry carried home lessons about courage, leadership under fire, and the importance of tactical innovation. These lessons would one day shape his actions on Lake Erie. By the time the War of 1812 erupted, Perry had already climbed the ranks to become a master commandant. At first, his duties kept him along the Atlantic coast, where he oversaw squadrons of small gunboats defending harbors and waterways. Though important, this role felt like a backwater assignment for a man hungry to prove himself. Perry longed for greater responsibility, for the kind of command that would test his abilities against a worthy enemy. His chance came in early 1813, when the U.S. Navy, desperate to challenge Britain's dominance on the Great Lakes, appointed him to take charge of building and commanding a fleet on Lake Erie. It was, by any measure, a daunting mission. There was no established naval yard, no fleet in existence, and few sailors with experience on the Great Lakes. To many officers, the assignment looked like career suicide. But Perry saw it differently. For him, it was the opportunity of a lifetime, to lead, to innovate, and perhaps to secure his place in history. His resolve would transform what seemed like an impossible task into one of the most celebrated naval victories in American memory. When Oliver Hazard Perry arrived at Presque Isle, Pennsylvania in March 1813, he encountered a scene that looked more like a frontier construction camp than a naval base. There was no shipyard, no stockpiles of timber, no warehouses of iron or canvas. Instead, there were forests, dense stands of oak and pine, and a few determined men working with axes and saws. Perry's task was nothing short of extraordinary. He had to build an entire fleet from scratch hundreds of miles from the ocean, in a region with virtually no infrastructure to support naval construction. Master shipwright Noah Brown had already begun the Herculean task of turning standing trees into warships. The sound of axes echoed through the wilderness as men felled timber, shaped it into planks, and began raising the frames of vessels that would soon fight on Lake Erie. It was an operation that demanded both ingenuity and stamina. Every single component, cannons, anchors, iron fittings, even the ropes and sails, had to be transported overland from distant cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Roads were little more than muddy trails, and oxen hauled supplies across miles of rough terrain. The logistical challenges were staggering, yet Perry threw himself into the effort with relentless energy. He oversaw every stage of the process, pushing his men to work through long hours and unpredictable weather. Local blacksmiths hammered out fittings, while farmers loaned horses and wagons to transport vital materials. This was not the polished efficiency of a royal dockyard in London, it was raw, improvised industry in the American wilderness. Two brigs, the Lawrence and the Niagara, emerged as the backbone of Perry's new fleet. Each carried 20 guns, designed to unleash devastating broadsides at close range. Alongside them, smaller schooners and sloops, like the Scorpion, Ariel, Somers, Porcupine, and Tigress, were built to provide speed and flexibility. Perry named his flagship Lawrence in honor of Captain James Lawrence, who had died in combat against the British while famously declaring, "Don't give up the ship." Those words became Perry's personal motto and were stitched onto a battle flag that would inspire his men when the fighting came. What Perry and his builders accomplished in just a few months bordered on the miraculous. Out of raw wood and sheer determination, they created a fleet where none had existed before. This feat alone symbolized the resilience of the young republic. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, Americans could muster the resourcefulness to meet any challenge. The stage was now set for Perry to test his makeshift fleet against Britain's seasoned navy. Building ships was only half of Perry's challenge. Warships without trained sailors were little more than floating wooden shells, and the Great Lakes had no ready pool of experienced naval men to draw from. The regular U.S. Navy could spare only a handful of veterans, and the frontier towns around Lake Erie were filled with farmers and tradesmen, not seasoned mariners. Yet Perry needed crews for 9 vessels and he needed them fast. What he assembled was one of the most diverse fighting forces in early American naval history. His sailors came from all walks of life, regular Navy men sent from the coast, local volunteers eager to serve, freed African Americans seeking opportunity, recent immigrants who barely spoke English, and even a few former British prisoners who had switched sides. At a time when military units were typically homogeneous, Perry's force stood out as an unlikely mixture of cultures, races, and backgrounds. This diversity created both challenges and opportunities. Training such a group required creativity. Many recruits had never handled a cannon, let alone maneuvered sails under battle conditions. Perry established rigorous training routines at Presque Isle. Men practiced loading and firing guns until they could operate them instinctively. They learned how to reef sails, repair rigging, and steer in formation. Communication was another obstacle. Language barriers and cultural differences often caused confusion. Perry overcame this by drilling simple, clear signals and fostering a sense of shared purpose. Leadership was crucial. Perry demanded discipline, but he also understood the realities of frontier service. He balanced strict naval order with a measure of flexibility, earning the respect of men who were not accustomed to rigid military life. His constant presence among them, working, training, and encouraging, built a spirit of loyalty. Gradually, this unlikely collection of recruits began to resemble a real fighting squadron. The diversity of Perry's crew later proved to be one of its greatest strengths. In the chaos of naval combat, adaptability was vital, and these men, drawn from so many different backgrounds, had learned to rely on one another despite differences. Their unity under pressure reflected the larger American experiment, a nation of varied people striving toward a common cause. By the time Perry's ships slid into Lake Erie, his sailors were no longer a ragtag assortment of strangers. They were a crew bound together by discipline, determination, and their commander's unshakable will. While Oliver Hazard Perry struggled to build a fleet from scratch, the British were far from idle. Command of their squadron on Lake Erie fell to Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, a seasoned officer of the Royal Navy. Born in Scotland in 1786, Barclay had already seen action in Europe's greatest battles, including Trafalgar, where he lost his left arm fighting under Admiral Nelson. Despite that devastating wound, Barclay continued his career with determination, earning a reputation as a bold and capable commander. By the time he took charge on Lake Erie, he brought with him not only the confidence of a veteran but also the aura of a man who had already faced the world's fiercest naval clashes. Barclay's fleet was smaller in number than Perry's eventual squadron, but it was stronger in several crucial ways. His flagship, the Detroit, carried 19 guns and was supported by the Queen Charlotte, the brig General Hunter, the schooners Lady Prevost and Chippeway, and the sloop Little Belt. These vessels were armed primarily with long-range cannons, giving the British a deadly advantage. Their guns could pound American ships from a distance, forcing Perry's fleet, armed mostly with short-range carronades, to close the gap before they could respond effectively. In the age of sail, that distance meant the difference between survival and destruction. The British also had geography and logistics on their side, at least initially. Their base at Amherst Bug near Detroit gave them a secure anchor point on the western edge of Lake Erie. From there, they could patrol the lake, disrupt American movements, and protect supply routes that kept their garrisons in the Northwest Territory alive. For more than a year, British squadrons had sailed the lake with near impunity, reinforcing their dominance and feeding American anxieties. For Perry, the prospect of facing Barclay was daunting. He had an untested fleet, inexperienced crews, and ships designed for close-quarter fighting, yet his enemy was led by a veteran officer commanding vessels that excelled at long-range duels. Many observers expected the Americans to be crushed. Even within the Navy, some saw Perry's assignment as a near-hopeless mission. But Barclay, for all his strengths, faced challenges of his own. His crews were undermanned, his supply lines were stretched thin, and the pressure to maintain British dominance without reinforcements was mounting. The stage was set for a contest not just of firepower, but of leadership, strategy, and sheer willpower. Perry's audacity would soon be tested against Barclay's experience in one of the most consequential naval encounters of the war. Even after his ships were constructed, Perry faced a critical problem before he could even think about engaging the enemy. Presque Isle Bay, where his fleet was anchored, was protected by a shallow sandbar at its mouth. This natural barrier had both advantages and dangers. It shielded the American squadron from sudden British attacks, but it also trapped Perry's largest ships inside the bay. Fully loaded with cannons, men, and supplies, the big brigs, the Lawrence and the Niagara, could not clear the bar. If Perry left them inside, they would be useless. If he tried to move them across, the British could easily strike while his ships were helpless. It was a classic strategic dilemma. Perry refused to accept defeat by geography. He devised a painstaking plan to lighten his heavier vessels, remove their cannons, and float them across the sandbar. Supplies and armaments were ferried separately in smaller boats, then reloaded once the ships reached open water. It was a dangerous gamble, and all of it had to be done under the watchful eyes of British patrols. On August 4, 1813, Perry made his move. Instead of trying to sneak across quietly, he turned the operation into a psychological maneuver. He positioned his smaller, armed vessels to protect the crossing, daring the British to attack. When Captain Robert Finney's, leading the advanced British squadron, observed the Americans, he found himself in a tactical puzzle. Perry had arranged his forces so that any attempt to strike the vulnerable brigs would mean closing into short range against American ships designed for exactly that kind of fighting. For British doctrine, which emphasized keeping enemies at a distance, the risk was too high. Finney's held back, and the Americans completed the operation without serious interference. This moment was more than a logistical success. It was Perry's first real psychological victory. He had turned a seemingly impossible situation into a demonstration of tactical ingenuity. By bluffing the British into inaction, he freed his fleet to sail Lake Erie. His ships were finally where they needed to be, and his crews could begin the intense training required for the battle that was surely coming. The crossing of the sandbar showed the qualities that would define Perry throughout the campaign: creativity, boldness, and the ability to manipulate enemy expectations. With his fleet now afloat on Lake Erie, Perry had removed one of the greatest obstacles to challenging British supremacy. The confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when. Once Perry's fleet was finally free on Lake Erie, his task shifted from building ships and bluffing enemies to forging his squadron into a fighting machine. The summer of 1813 became a period of relentless training. Perry knew that most of his men had little or no naval combat experience, and their survival in a confrontation with the British would depend on discipline, skill, and instinct. So he drilled them day after day, transforming a diverse collection of recruits into sailors who could function with precision under fire. Gunnery was the top priority. The short-range carronades on Perry's brigs were powerful but required crews to operate them quickly and effectively under the chaos of battle. Men practiced loading, aiming, and firing until they could complete the process in near darkness or blinding smoke. Perry wanted them to be able to handle the weapons almost without thinking, relying on muscle memory when stress and confusion would overwhelm the mind. He also trained his crews in signaling and maneuvering, ensuring that every sailor knew his place in the fleet's battle line and could react instantly to orders. Damage control was another essential skill. Naval battles of the era often left ships splintered, rigging torn apart, and decks slick with blood. Perry made sure his men understood how to plug holes, replace damaged lines, and keep their vessel afloat even while under heavy attack. These preparations gave the Americans a chance to withstand the brutal punishment they knew the British long-range guns could inflict before they managed to close the distance. Meanwhile, Perry confronted a larger strategic challenge. His ships were designed for close combat, but Lake Erie was notorious for unpredictable winds. If the breeze failed him, his fleet might never reach effective range. Perry studied weather patterns, considered multiple contingencies, and resolved to act decisively when the moment of battle arrived. He understood that hesitation or miscalculation could doom his entire squadron. At the same time, British supplies were dwindling. Barclay's men at Amherstburg were running low on food and munitions, while native allies grew restless waiting for promised support. This pressure forced Barclay's hand. Eventually he would have to risk a battle to reopen supply lines. Perry's tireless training ensured that when that day came, his men would not fight as raw recruits but as a disciplined, determined naval force. The stage was set. Both squadrons prepared for an inevitable clash that would decide the fate of the Northwest, and perhaps the direction of the entire war. At dawn on September 10, 1813, lookouts spotted sails on the horizon. Captain Robert Barclay had finally made his move, leading 6 British ships out onto Lake Erie to challenge Perry's 9-vessel squadron. On paper, the Americans had numerical superiority, but the British advantage in long-range firepower and seasoned crews made the outcome anything but certain. Perry raised his famous blue battle flag aboard the Lawrence, emblazoned with Captain James Lawrence's dying words, "Don't give up the ship." Every sailor could see the motto, a reminder of what was at stake. The winds that morning favored Barclay. They were light and variable, making it difficult for Perry's fleet to close the distance quickly. This played directly into British hands, allowing their long guns to open fire before the Americans could bring their short-range carronades into play. At 11:45 a.m., the first British shots thundered across the water, slamming into the Lawrence. The American flagship was still too far away to respond effectively, forcing Perry and his crew to endure a withering bombardment. For nearly 45 agonizing minutes, the Lawrence absorbed punishment. Cannonballs smashed through her hull, rigging, and decks. Splinters of wood flew like shrapnel, cutting down sailors in gruesome fashion. Blood slicked the planks while smoke and screams filled the air. Yet Perry remained on deck, calm and unshaken, urging his men to hold steady. His presence alone kept morale intact, proving that leadership in the heat of battle could inspire men to endure horrors that might otherwise break them. Complicating matters, Perry's second-in-command, Captain Jesse Elliott aboard the Niagara, failed to provide immediate support. Instead of engaging the British Queen Charlotte as planned, Elliott held back at long range, leaving the Lawrence to face multiple enemy ships almost alone. Whether through caution, misinterpretation of orders, or unwillingness to risk his ship, Elliott's hesitation allowed the British to focus their firepower on Perry's flagship. By mid-afternoon, the Lawrence was a shattered wreck. 4/5 of her crew were dead or wounded, her guns dismounted, and her rigging destroyed. Most commanders would have surrendered under such circumstances, but Perry was no ordinary commander. Rather than strike his colors, he prepared to make one of the boldest moves in naval history, abandoning his ruined flagship to continue the fight elsewhere. With the Lawrence reduced to a wreck, most naval officers would have struck their colors and surrendered. But Oliver Hazard Perry refused to accept defeat. In one of the most daring acts in naval history, he gathered a small crew, took his battle flag and boarded a rowboat in the middle of the firefight. Cannonballs splashed around him as he crossed the open water toward the Niagara. To both fleets, the sight was astonishing. Commanders did not abandon their flagships under fire, they were expected to go down with them. Perry's decision shattered convention and electrified morale. His men saw that their leader would not quit, while the British were stunned by his audacity. When Perry climbed aboard the Niagara, he found her almost untouched, her crew fresh and her guns ready. Captain Jesse Elliott had kept her at a distance, but now Perry seized command with characteristic decisiveness. He ordered the ship forward into close action, determined to unleash the full weight of her broadside at the heart of the British line. The effect was immediate and devastating. Perry maneuvered the Niagara directly through the enemy formation in a bold tactic known as crossing the T. This allowed his guns to rake multiple British ships at once, pouring fire into their decks while they struggled to return effective shots. At the same time, other American vessels, previously held back by wind conditions, closed in, surrounding the battered British squadron. Chaos erupted in the enemy line. The Queen Charlotte collided with another vessel, her rigging tangled and her guns silenced. The Detroit, already heavily damaged, lost command as Captain Barclay was gravely wounded. One by one the British ships could no longer resist. By 3 p.m. their flags were lowered. The seemingly invincible Royal Navy squadron on Lake Erie had surrendered. Perry wasted no time in sending his now legendary message to General William Henry Harrison: "We have met the enemy and they are ours." In a few short hours he had turned near certain defeat into complete victory. His bold transfer of command, his ability to inspire his men, and his decisive use of tactics transformed the course of the battle. Lake Erie was now an American lake, and the momentum of the war shifted dramatically in favor of the United States. The Battle of Lake Erie was far more than a naval engagement. It was a decisive turning point in the War of 1812 and a defining moment for the young United States. With the British squadron destroyed, American forces gained total control of the lake. This immediately severed British supply lines to Detroit and the Northwest Territory, forcing them to abandon key positions. General William Henry Harrison seized the opportunity, launching an invasion across Lake Erie. The retreating British and their native allies were crushed at the Battle of the Thames, where the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh was killed. His death marked the collapse of organized native resistance in the region, reshaping the balance of power on the frontier. The psychological and political impact of Perry's victory was just as significant. Until that point, the war had been deeply unpopular in many parts of the United States, especially in New England where trade had been crippled. But news of the triumph electrified the nation. Newspapers celebrated Perry as a hero, songs were written in his honor, and Congress awarded him a gold medal. His victory proved that the U.S. Navy, still in its infancy, could defeat the Royal Navy, the most feared maritime force in the world. For a nation struggling to define itself on the global stage, this was a profound boost in confidence. Equally important were the lessons in leadership and innovation. Perry's refusal to surrender, his ability to rally a diverse crew, and his audacious transfer of command during battle all became symbols of American resilience. "Don't give up the ship" was more than a motto stitched on a flag. It became a guiding principle for the U.S. Navy, representing determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Perry's tactics, particularly his aggressive decision to close range and exploit his carronades, influenced naval doctrine for decades. The cost of victory was steep. The Lawrence suffered an 80% casualty rate, making it one of the bloodiest single-ship actions in American history. British losses were also severe, with many experienced officers killed or wounded, including Captain Barclay, who lost his remaining arm. Yet out of the carnage emerged a story that continues to inspire. Perry's triumph demonstrated that resourcefulness, courage and unity could overcome superior firepower and daunting challenges. Today, monuments and memorials honor the battle as a cornerstone of American naval tradition. The victory at Lake Erie endures not just as a military success, but as a testament to the power of leadership and determination to shape history itself.